we're seeing something surprising happening in the beleaguered nation of Argentina. Greenbacks that have been sitting inertly under mattresses of the huddled masses for decades are suddenly flowing out and into the banking sector. It's a phenomenon akin to an underground aquifer suddenly bubbling up through the parched soil. For years, the reservoir of human anxiety, insecurity, and distrust has been steadily accumulating among ordinary Argentine citizens. Economic crises have come in panicked waves, eroding faith in institutions, punishing the prudent and proliferating black markets. In such an environment, it's only rational for people to hoard whatever hard currency they can get their hands on and bury it deep underground, away from the raging economic storms on the surface. But something has changed. A new force has entered the scene, generating an upwelling of that long-submerged spring of savings. I'm talking, of course, about the tousle-haired populist Javier Milei and his unconventional economic reforms. The data tells the story starkly. Dollar deposits in Argentine banks have surged over 40% to $19.8 billion just since Milei took office on December 10th. That's the highest level in over 3 years. We're seeing a dramatic reversal of the steady capital flight that has plagued this nation. It would be an oversimplification to say this is blind faith in the new president. No, this is something more psychologically complex. A strange brew of skepticism overcome, prudent optimism, and a dash of opportunism stirred in. Let's unpack the sociological roots of this phenomenon. At the core, we are seeing the manifestation of a deep human need for economic security and stability. For too long, Argentines have lived in fear that the ground will abruptly give way beneath their feet yet again. They have become masters at ducking and covering with their meager hard currency holdings the second any tremor of instability is detected. But Milei's guerrilla candor and defiant Argentid seem to awaken something in the collective Pueblo wisdom. Here is a man unbowed by the rigid orthodoxies, unafraid of controversy and unconcerned with artificial decorum. He represents a tantalizing new path, one that could finally lead away from the endless repeating cycles of crisis, stagnation, and immiseration. In Milei's rhetoric, Argentines hear the unbridled idea of the national psyche howling. It is the primal scream against the elite impunity, institutional rot, and hypocritical moralizing that has condemned whole generations to a subsistence peasant's existence on lands of immense natural abundance. The new president channels the collective societal sense of being lied to, deceived and cheated by an insular clique of charlatans masquerading as serious policymakers. There is a deep emotional resonance when Milei bellows, with trademark ardor, about finally unleashing a revolution of common sense upon the fossilized economic structures. Indeed, it is common sense that has been in such perilously short supply here. The populace has time and again been subjected to extreme medicine by radical quacks in a desperate bid to restart the flame of prosperity. So when Milei promises a sweeping economic amnesty program to finally pardon citizens for their rational, self-preserving impulse to keep wealth out of the dysfunctional banking system, it opens a psychological release valve. At long last, accountability is being shifted onto the true culprits, the ideology-addled elite who peddled a smorgasbord of miracle cures from across the discredited economic spectrum. One can easily envision how, when a messenger channels the accumulated bitterness over decades of betrayal, while absolving individual families of guilt for simply trying to survive, it clears away mountains of mistrust. This is the key psychological dynamic catalyzing the flow of funds into banks. To the analytical mind, the mechanics of the economic amnesty law are straightforward enough in their mercantile quid pro quo. Argentine citizens can declare up to $100,000 in cash without paying taxes on it. Any excess is taxed at an appealingly low 5% rate or can be exempted if invested locally into bonds, real estate, or certain other exceptions. Accounting, legal, and business experts are understandably bullish, like Sebastian Dominguez, who gushes it's a very low-cost opportunity for citizens to finally profitably mobilize the dollars that today are stuck in a safety deposit box. But the flow of dollars is about more than just coldly rational economic incentives. It's an emotional pivot away from decades of profound insecurity, alienation, and dread of state predation. Milei's very persona as an outrageous, irrepressible free spirit has tapped into something deeper in the cultural soul. Of course, the great eternal mystery of Argentina is why such a nation dripping with natural resources and formidable human capital should suffer such deprivation, cyclical crises, and lost economic potential. It is a land with a per capita income level equivalent to New Jersey, yet exponentially more socio-economic dislocation, chaotic undercurrents, and instability. One potential clue to this paradox bubbles up through an anecdote from the country's turbulent history, one that reveals the fragility of even seemingly mighty institutions to the immense pressures of fear and insecurity. In early 1989, during one of the infamous hyperinflation spikes, mobs of panicked citizens tried to preemptively drain the banking system of its deposits before their money became utterly worthless. Images of lines stretching for blocks outside bank branches abound from that period. But the most striking scene was inside, where armed soldiers were called in to form phalanxes attempting to beat back the crush of humanity desperately rushing the bank's barricades. What ultimately halted this generalized bank run and unraveling of the financial system wasn't any sound economic policy shift or return of confidence in the currency. No, it was reportedly something much more brutally visceral. The soldiers began opening fire into the crowds with their rifles and pistols, bloodily dispersing the masses and stanching the hemorrhaging of deposits. Consider the symbolism of that moment. Even armed military force, the supposed ultima ratio of a modern state's legitimacy and authority, was ultimately unable to stem the primal tides of human fear over debased money. All trappings of institutional order and civil society melted away in an atavistic superposition of greed, desperation, and chaos. Perhaps this dark historical epiphany reveals the true key to understanding why Argentina's enormous economic potential remains largely untapped. The roots of prosperity require firmer ground than mere physical resources, demographics, or industrial prowess. More fundamental is the cultivation of individual and societal resilience against the innate human impulses of rashness, fear, and selfish short-termism. When a populace sees the very capillaries of the financial system as a rapacious predator to be escaped at all costs, rather than as the circulatory life force of broader wealth creation, the more Hobbesian proclivities of human nature assert themselves. It's an environment where those who exhibit only frantic self-preservation through capital flight, cash hoarding, and off-books activity are advantaged over those who abide patiently with the system. That institutionalizes a mindset that is inherently antithetical to economic flourishing. Yet Milei seems to intuit something profound about the cyclical hopelessness and mistrust that chronically pulls even natural economic abundances into a black hole of dysfunction. Perhaps his secret sauce is to unabashedly speak to, channel, and validate the irrational and emotional inner voices in a way that somehow helps neutralize their destructive potency. The hyperkinetic Presidente, who has been puckishly dubbed Tropical Trump by some foreign press, undoubtedly has more than a whiff of demagogic pugnaciousness about him. But look deeper into his sermons against the corrupt economic priestly caste, and you'll find more than mere cynical gamesmanship. There are glimmers of genuine sociological perspicacity lurking. When Milei provocatively rails against the anti-people immorality of economic policies that cruelly punished responsible savers and forced capital into offshore exile or the underground informal economy, he is hitting at a core truth. The state's contempt for economic liberty, its endless shell game of taxation, regulation, fines, and crony favoritism, subverts the social solidarity required for a functional market system and civic order. Milei's core populist indictment is that successive regimes of both the left and right have been mostly obsessed with perpetuating their own power and privilege while the masses become increasingly alienated from the formal economic system. This gradually discredits the entire market-based paradigm as a rigged game and fatally severs the sense of trust and buy-in from the citizenry that is vital for capitalism to sustainably operate. Instead, Argentines increasingly resorted to crony traditionalist subsistence patterns or the black market as the only refuge from the perpetual chaos and grift of the above-ground economy. With his trademark mane of blonde hair and exaggerated dismissive shrugs, the rabble-rousing Milei seems to sense the frustrations of the forgotten masses who have been repeatedly burned by the policy shearing and devaluations visited upon them. There's an almost ritualistic catharsis to his rallies, where he feigns shooting down the corrupt economic elite's feckless rationalizations like so many clay pigeons on a skeet range. Only someone who has tapped into some deeper vein of societal discontent could have mounted such a meteoric insurgent movement from the fringes. Milei channels an almost mystical sense of Argentine ancestral identity that was systematically betrayed, a prelapsarian national Eden squandered through decades of elite folly. It strikes a visceral chord of recognition within the aggrieved masses that no amount of dry technocratic policy tweaks could ever replicate. The new president seems to understand that economic trauma on this scale imprints powerfully in the realm of folk memory, myth, and identity. His purported economic amnesty is thus brilliantly devised as more than just a technocratic financial maneuver, but also a ceremonial exorcism to expunge the stigma of the cash informality thrust upon Argentines. With almost ritualistic theatrics, Milei is absolving and welcoming back the economic sinners who were forced into the shadows simply through the human impulse to survive. The amnesty serves as a mass collective rite of reincorporation, an ingathering of the tribes back into public economic life without shame or punishment for actions that had become necessary adaptations. In that sense, the repatriated dollars bubbling back into the formal banking system represents a deeper acquittal of a divided national soul. Milei is attempting to reassemble the frayed social solidarity required for Argentines to invest faith and personal effort into collective economic structures again. Whether this gambit ultimately yields sustained economic revival remains to be seen, of course. But the flow of hoarded cash into banks is at minimum an arresting symbol of the shifting tides in national psychology and the power of redemptive narratives. After all, hard currency savings stashed under mattresses are more than just inert economic resources. They represent the angst-hardened emotional husks of past traumas, future fears, and a fatalistic hedge against civic breakdown. As such, their unlocking and mobilization into productive enterprise signals a rekindling of social trust and forward-looking aspiration at the deepest human level. And make no mistake, the sums involved here are staggering even if still below their 2019 peak. Central bank data shows dollar holdings in the official banking system have risen $5.7 billion since Milei took office, with around $1.4 billion of that following directly in the wake of the economic amnesty law on July 17. Experts estimate a floor of $2 billion replenishment of the system from the amnesty program, even though untold amounts remain stashed away. That number is still a relative trickle compared to broader estimates of over $200 billion in total undeclared dollar cash held by Argentines who kept it off the books for self-preservation. With the memories of economic whiplash, punitive taxes, and inflation debaucheries still so fresh, the populace retains a formidable reservoir of skepticism. Some have continued voting with their financial feet by keeping assets domiciled offshore or stored locally in physically securitized forms like cash, real estate, or gold rather than fickle paper bank deposits. The nation's persistent net negative reserve position hovering around -$6 billion reflects this endemic shortfall of faith and capital. Yet even these stubborn realities belie the raw power of the subtle psychological shifts catalyzed by Milei's reform efforts and improbable rise from the fringes. Something primal appears to be stirring, a long-repressed and smoldering force deep within the crucible of Argentine society that may be finally exhaling in cathartic release. Call it a rekindling of an ancient tribal identity or soul that had grown embittered and despairing of wholeness. Viewed through this archetypal lens, the humble acts of citizens extracting caches of greenbacks from underneath mattresses, floorboards, coat pockets, and tucked-away envelopes represent a sacred unbinding of sorts. It's akin to the unwrapping of spiritual mummies ready to reintegrate into an intergenerational procession toward renewal. In this light, Milei's reforms take on an almost biblical significance, a great economic jubilee and reintegration of the scattered and exiled tribes back into the national family after long sojourns in the psychological and financial wilderness. It's an awakening that seems to stir the ghosts of Argentina's glorious Belle Epoque period around the turn of the 20th century, when it ranked as one of the wealthiest societies on Earth. In that distant era, waves of European immigration poured into this land of untrammeled promise, mingling with the indigenous gaucho culture to forge a distinctly new world hybrid vigor. Airy ateliers, grand Parisian-style avenues, and elegant cafes proliferated across a booming Buenos Aires, symbolic of the high-minded cultural ambitions of a projected Southern Hemisphere's beacon. For a brief shining historical moment, Argentina's scintillating pluralistic identity cohered, as it enjoyed all the economic dynamism and cosmopolitan openness to global trends of a great power in the making. But like all human glories, this golden age could not be permanently sustained. The tides of history ebbed, as endemic institutional weaknesses festered beneath the prosperous facade. An insular, anti-modern cronyism incubated one which erected increasingly baroque layers of protectionism, introversion, and what the poet Leopoldo Lugones decried as the idolatry of the caudillos, the arrogation of power by the cult of strongman personalities. This shadowed the enlightened Europeanist vision with the sprawling tendrils of a chronic autoimmune syndrome that gradually disabled Argentina's previous paradigm of vibrant cross-pollination and creative merger with outside influences. Instead, an almost autarkic tradition took hold, one which defensively weaponized folkloric mythos and parochialism as both psychological armor and rationale for insulation. And so, at least in the collective unconscious of the people, the national journey abruptly reversed course. Where once waves of human arrivals and capital inflows were welcomed as accelerating the march of progress, their polarities inverted into something culturally toxic and threatening to the increasingly dominant revanchist nativism. Through this prism, the iconic harboring of greenbacks under mattresses and other defensive hoarding behaviors arguably took on almost totemic spiritual significance. They represented the psychological privatization of an outward-looking identity that had grown too damaged and reclusive to face the perceived humiliations of the outside world. So the stashed-away cash represents more than just a protection against governmental ineptitude and runaway inflation. These verdant seeds of capital sown in the underground gardens of the informal economy became communal symbols of a fallen nation gamely resisting, at a microcosmic level, the inward entropy pulling all into petrified immobility. This might help explain how previous regimes launched such furious crackdowns and military enforcement to compel citizens to disgorge their hoarded cashes back into the moribund state banking system. It wasn't just about extracting monetary resources, but also trying to extinguish reservoirs of individuality and economic self-determination that had taken on existential psychological power. Viewed from this cultural mythic lens, Milei's supposedly technocratic policies towards normalizing dollar usage and declaring an amnesty for shadowed wealth holdings signify something deceptively profound. They are rituals meant to reanimate the original genetic codebase of Argentina as a vibrant, cosmopolitan entrepot, before the introspective lapsing into the deadening trance of defensive solipsism and sterile dogmas. With his outlandish attire, wild hand gestures, and irreverent taunting of the calcified elites, Milei embodies the charismatic trickster figure of the societal return of the repressed. He seems to be beckoning his countrymen back out onto the stage of integrated global economic symphonies, rather than dourly muting themselves permanently as so many atomized voices scattered into the underbrush of isolation. This incantatory power is embedded within the very numerology of the amnesty program itself. Its potent symbolism includes the talismanic figures of $100,000. The maximum nest egg to be declared without penalty after years of fearful sequestration. The 5% taxation rate on excess cash represents yet another tantalizing reconciliation right, aiming to reintegrate vast subterranean pools of capital into the formally sanctioned daylight realm at minimal social or economic cost. Such numerological amalgams appear consciously constructed to embody harmonic convergences, awakenings, and the ideal proportions for a decisive breaking of historic systemic trances. Whether the president was explicitly aware of such symbolic resonances is almost immaterial when held up against the sheer scale of the psychological remoralization now underway.